One of the staples of science fiction and fantasy fiction is the evil army that needs to be stopped. It's not a new narrative by any means. Every genre has that scene where the lone hero steps out, or maybe a few plucky friends, and takes a stand against the forces of darkness. Orcs, goblins, dark elves, zombies, aliens, take your pick. They're bad and aren't here to negotiate. The heroes mowing down legions of enemies is a power fantasy that dates back to the days of mythology. Modern myths, the fantasy and sci-fi sagas we've come to love, are chock full of them. From Star Wars' stormtroopers to Lord of the Rings' orc armies. Be it Dungeons & Dragons, Warhammer 40k, or even Resident Evil, the evil army serves as the ultimate cannon fodder. You can knock down as many as you want, and never feel anything more than catharsis, because hey, they're evil. And I'd be lying if I said some of the coolest scenes in genre history aren't just a few heroes fighting armies of darkness. I mean, the entire movie Army of Darkness is just one awesome scene after the other. But what if we extended it beyond an army? What if it's an evil race? A species of creatures so foul, so evil, that the only moral obligation you have is to obliterate them in their entirety. In games, that's a useful tool. Evil races and species lend themselves well for random encounters, where the players shouldn't think too hard about what they're doing. In films or books, they can lend themselves to cool set pieces, where the heroes can take them down one at a time. But as characters, well, they're kind of boring, aren't they? Pure evil is kind of hard to fathom, especially entire races where evil, not survival, not some higher goal, not even necessarily logical objectives, is the highest good for them. An entire race with evil programmed into their DNA is dull. What do they want? To hurt others? Why? Because they're evil? See, it just creates a creative dead end, and I'm not the biggest fan of creative dead ends. That's the naive statement I put on Twitter, the platform where ideas are intellectually discussed, a few days ago, as of this writing. And immediately, I got the response you'd expect from that kind of site. Tons of people provided counterexamples of evil races to show how wrong I was. Except most of the counterexamples weren't actually evil races. So naturally, like any reasonable person, I responded. Clearly the smartest idea in the room, I am full of these. But what surprised me more was that in my response, a lot of people agreed with me. Even people who initially disagreed seemed to come around when I laid out my case. Within a day, tens of thousands of people responded to my post, and many of them argued, and I responded, and I used the notes from that conversation to draft this video essay. My argument is simple. What a lot of people confuse for pure evil races is actually a little more complicated. There are very few races that are pure evil due to evil being hardwired into their DNA. Rather, creatives find more interesting ways to justify a culture being an adversary for their heroes. Additionally, just because a race is dangerous to us doesn't make them inherently evil, but on that same note, a race not being evil doesn't automatically make them much of softies either. The final portion of this video will analyze the one way I think an evil race or society is most compelling, when they're used to serve an internal conflict rather than an external one. Now before we start, I do want to emphasize I'm not going to draw any real-world parallels between these fictional races and real human society. The reason for this is that we've all had this discussion already. We all know those talking points, and I don't want to make any broad assumptions about the authors in question and their intentionality with the text. I want to analyze this topic from a different perspective as well. I'm reading this as a storyteller. Does this make a compelling narrative? If you're expecting a discussion about that, you're not going to get it here. Rather, we're going to focus right now on storytelling.
And what's he then that says I play the villain?
For the purposes of this video, let's define evil. An evil act is when you do something awful to someone with the intent of causing pain or suffering, either out of rage, bigotry, hatred, or just the sake of it. However, you have to be able to understand the intent of your actions, and it can't be a byproduct of your evolutionary processes. A lion isn't evil for eating a gazelle, nor are you evil for stepping on a spider. But if you picked up a spider and plucked its legs off, Yeah, that's evil. Does it make sense? Good. Now look, purely based on the number of responses I got, I'm going to cut off the worst counter-argument I received at the start.
Please, God.
This is God.
No, I love evil villains. Saying a race of pure evil is boring is not the same as saying a pure evil villain is boring. I really don't want every bad guy to be a misunderstood sad boy.
Destruction! Destruction is what makes life worth living!
Now, what makes a villain like the Joker or Freddy Krueger fascinating isn't that they're secretly tragic, but rather that they choose to be as vile as they are. If you break both of these characters down to their basic characteristics, they're very small, very petty men, but their theatrical side, their menace, their cruelty, that makes them compelling. And the fact that they constantly choose to be this vile, to go to such lengths to enact their cruelty, that's compelling. What makes evil interesting, at least to me, is the choice to be evil. Many villains have incredible abilities, but simply make self-serving or convenient choices to reach their goals faster. Even if the goals are sympathetic, their choice to inflict harm makes them vile and compelling. This is especially true if the villain seems to lack the moral limitations that keep most of us normal people from diving off the deep end. And you can see this everywhere, from the classic works of literature like Iago from Othello or Aaron the Moor from Titus Andronicus, all the way up to No Country for Old Men's Anton and Dragon Ball Z's Cell. Yeah, I bet you didn't expect me to compare Dragon Ball Z to Shakespeare, but that's where we're at right now. Claudius from Hamlet is, by most accounts, an actually decent king, but he still murdered his brother to get the throne. While he feels guilty over the murder, he never asks for redemption, because that would mean facing the consequences of his actions, or giving up what he has. And he doesn't want that. They see themselves as evil, even if they have admirable qualities. And that's interesting. Other villains are total monsters, but see themselves as the hero. Every 90s kid probably thought of Frollo when I thought of that. Going forward, we need a baseline as to what I consider to be pure evil. There is one that personifies evil the most. In my opinion, of course. That's Michael Myers from Halloween. Every other villain has some goal, either selfish or grandiose, and they serve that goal. But Myers? He just wants to hurt people. He doesn't seem to take any enjoyment in it like Freddy Krueger. He just does it. There's no catharsis, no release, no end goal. He just does awful things and takes up space. Michael Myers is fascinating because he exists as a dark counterpoint to humanity, with our need for things to make sense. Myers makes no sense. He's not necessarily chaos, he's just evil. But if there were to say, be 1,000 Michael Myers walking around in Halloween, it would be dull. Myers is fascinating because he's singular. So on that note, let's stop talking about individual villains and start talking about villainous races and species.
I'm telling you, there's something moving and it ain't us.
Now, before we get into the weeds here, we need to ask, how do we define evil races? Well, I found there are two categories based on my discussions. Races that are perceived as evil and races that are truly evil. Now, to reiterate, I find races that are pure evil to be pretty boring, but races that are perceived as evil are incredibly fascinating. Now, you might wonder what's the difference, but trust me, there's a big difference. A truly evil race is just evil on a genetic level. You're born vile, you die vile. You can't ever change, that's it, end of story. But a perceived evil enemy is often seen as evil by the heroic faction, who might have legitimate reasons to dislike the enemy. We've seen stories where the society from which the protagonists come from have ran a hate campaign against a demographic in order to maintain power. There are situations where a certain species or culture might just come across as evil because they're an existential threat to our protagonist's survival. And in cases like these, the only solution is to fight or run. Often, these perceived evil races are only evil for specific reasons. They're territorial animals, and you're in their territory. They're hungry, and they need food. Or they're functioning on a level we as people just can't comprehend, with moral considerations beyond our understanding. For the first example, think the bugs from Starship Troopers. We put bases on the planets they infested, and now We're a threat to them. A fascist government takes over Earth to help combat the bugs, and they lose a lot. Whenever something bad happens, like the asteroid strike that wipes out Buenos Aires, the fascists blame the bugs. Now, when I first watched the movie, I was a little confused by the Buenos Aires asteroid strike scene. I mean, how did it happen? We see that the bugs can launch projectiles into the stratosphere, but across the galaxy, how could they launch an asteroid across the galaxy? I was a child, by the way, when I saw this movie. It took a little while for it to click. Obviously, the bugs didn't launch the asteroid. It just happened, and humanity wanted to use the tragedy to fuel their machine of war. The bugs are evil from our perspective, but at the end of the day, they're no more evil than hornets or wasps. Dangerous undeniably, but they probably wouldn't harm you if you didn't trample on their nests. Then there's the hungry race. The hungry boys who just want to eat, and we're on the menu. Killer Clowns from Outer Space is just about a bunch of silly guys on a road trip who make a pit stop for some grub. And we're the grub. Obviously, humanity sees them as evil, and there's no negotiating with these guys. But the clowns see us as dinner and a show. Obviously, you gotta fight them because they're not gonna stop, but they're not evil so much as hungry. But a more interesting example would be the Xenomorphs from Aliens. The Xenomorphs are just animals enacting their life cycle. They're feeding, procreating, doing things animals do. The only problem is they're doing it to humanity. And what makes the aliens so terrifying is their otherworldly nature and perfect design. They leave people violated and abused, but at the end of the day, they're doing it to survive. A xenomorph hatching inside a person is horrific, but then again, it's not like parasites don't do that already. Animals breed, eat, and defend their territory. That's just what they are, and that's just what the xenomorphs do.
You know, Burke, I don't know which species is worse. You don't see them fucking each other over for a goddamn percentage.
Now, the third example comes from things beyond our rational understanding. Their actions inflict harm, undeniably. People see them as evil, but from their perspectives, it's just hard to fathom what they're thinking. If evil is intent, and we can't really engage with that intent, then it makes us question the bedrock of our and their morality. Essentially, this is where things that are too weird for our morality go. Calling them evil is reductive, considering what they have going on. Now, on TV tropes, they call this a blue and orange morality. For a distinction on the alien versus moral, consider Lovecraft's mythos versus August Derleth's rewrite of the mythos. Lovecraft isn't exactly a flawless writer. And again, we're not going to go into racism today because that deserves its own focus. Lovecraft was extremely racist. But he did establish the Great Old Ones and Elder Gods as essentially beyond our understanding. To them, we're ants, or less. And are we evil if we step on an anthill by accident, not noticing it? Now, Derleth, meanwhile, after Lovecraft's passing, he was really responsible for keeping Lovecraft alive into the rest of the 20th century. He reinvented the Great Old Ones in his stories to be engaged in a battle of good and evil, like old gods. And it's so boring. It loses the appeal of these otherworldly intelligences that are beyond the scope of our comprehension. And these entities, yeah, they're often horrific and do not have our best intentions at heart, but they're so beyond good and evil that to anchor them to these terms limits the sheer horror on display. And this isn't a Lovecraftian apology video. This is just saying that they're so twisted, calling them evil reduces them. And that's not going to be the last time I say that either. But honestly, machines kind of count in this category too. Because a machine is just there to do a function. It has one job, and that's it.
Strength is irrelevant. Resistance is futile.
Then down came the claw. And that, love, was that.
When people think of evil races, demons are one of the first to come to mind, in part because some people actually believe demons exist. The thing about demons is, often they're incredibly cool looking, but more of them isn't necessarily better. You see one demon in a movie, book, film, game, and you're in for a world of terror. You see hundreds, and you're actually gonna be fine, probably. It's weird. Look at the Evil Dead series. Army of Darkness ends with thousands of deadites raiding a castle, but Ash and company just plow through them without a care in the world. But in the previous Evil Dead movies, Ash was getting his ass beat by singular demonic threats, one at a time. And those guys, they can be kind of scary when they're not making you laugh. They're a great force of evil. No complaints, no notes in any of the Evil Dead films. But I think one of the best demons in media is one we don't see. When people talk about The Exorcist, they don't talk about Pazuzu, they talk about Reagan. The demon isn't inherently interesting, but the harm the demon inflicts is. And that carries everyone throughout the film. And honestly, I'm kind of underselling Pazuzu here, because he's actually kind of interesting. He's a petty little bitch. Father Merrin exorcised him out of someone from Africa. It depends on which film you're watching. The films keep giving us different candidates for this, seriously. So when Father Merrin comes back in the original Exorcist to exorcise Pazuzu again, Pazuzu just kills him. When Karras eventually frees Reagan from Pazuzu, the petty little bitch puts the soul of a condemned serial killer into Karras' body just to torment him from beyond the grave. Like, Pazuzu's a great villain.
Listen here with this, Karras. Would you like to leave a message? I see that she gets it.
A singular demon can be terrifying, especially for the unprepared. But most often, hordes of demons means hordes of people that can get plowed down without a care in the world. Constantine, Devil May Cry, Doom. The more demons, the more our heroes can pulverize the demons. Doom gets to the point where the legions of hell are so demoralized fighting the Doomslayer that they deify him as their boogeyman, which, I mean, it's pretty badass, but it doesn't make the demons interesting as characters. So how do you make hordes of demons interesting? One strategy that's had success is diversifying the demonic army. Dungeons & Dragons had the novel approach to divide demons and devils into two separate races, with demons being chaotic evil monstrosities and devils being a hierarchy of lawful evil tyrants. And those two races have their own insular societies that follow their own structure. By doing this, it complicated devils and demons into a far more interesting and compelling hierarchy. Many would argue that the recent Baldur's Gate 3's central devil, Raphael, is a more compelling antagonist than the main villains of the game. And this is because Raphael offers a Faustian bargain to the players, and that game makes you question if the short-term results are worth Raphael's future machinations. Faustian bargains are a staple in this sort of fiction, from the original Story of Dr. Faustus to Madoka to the Twilight Zone, but one of the best examples of the Faustian bargain in recent memories is the Black Eclipse from Berserk, where, in exchange for incredible power, Griffith sacrifices the souls of his companions to the God Hand, eventually ascending to reach their ranks. What Berserk does so well is that Griffith, along with several apostles throughout the series, are people who underwent a Faustian bargain and emerged the other side a twisted monster. The God Hand deals with those who are most desperate and gives them their wishes in exchange for becoming essentially servants of darkness. They're people who by default chose to commit great evil, and thus their evil feels more palpable. It's a choice. Their demonic form is merely a reflection of the awfulness buried within their souls already. The only guidelines they follow are, do as thou wilt. The apostles are creatures of total debauchery, but everything they do is their choice, and that's interesting. But if we're talking about anime demons who are truly terrifying, look no further than Freyren. When we first encounter the demons of this world, they seem cordial, almost inviting. They are those among society who have forgotten the terrors of the Demon King that's beaten at the beginning of the series, due in part to their short lives relative to the titular elf. But we're told, and shown, we can never trust them, despite how sweet and inviting they might appear. Now, what's interesting about the demons in Freyren is that they aren't exactly evil, though they are undeniably dangerous. They're predators that imitate humanity to lure us into a position where they can eradicate us properly. They're wired differently than us. They're incapable of feeling the same things, but know how to pretend they can feel. They don't even seem to understand why, say, crying for one's mother elicits an emotional response. They just do that because they need to prey on humanity and need to stave off their own deaths. Now, don't get this twisted. Freywind shows us exactly what happens when humans trust demons. It ends badly. It's not good. Just because something is too alien to understand, good and evil, by our human standards, it doesn't make them any less dangerous. Trusting a demon is dumb. It's as dumb as sticking your head in a bear trap. If anything, the fact that demons don't seem to understand morals makes them even more frightening and more dangerous. But it's dangerous in a way that is compelling, rather than repetitive or dull. They're kind of like what the nobodies in Kingdom Hearts sounded like before you actually started talking to the nobodies in Kingdom Hearts. So while most demons are evil, some exist outside the binary of good and evil. But when discussing this, we always come to one inevitable point. The Cenobites from Hellraiser were humans who have explored the furthest regions of experience. They're essentially BDSM monks who see pain and mutilation as the highest good. In essence, they are us if our drive for self-pleasure and self-modification was taken to extremes. Though the Cenobites appear demonic, they're just people. In a lot of ways, the Cenobites are similar to Berserk's apostles, only with one key difference. The Cenobites didn't become monsters for power or out of desperation. They became monsters because they were bored of their ordinary lives and sought richer pleasures. And when they came out the other side of all their journeys, all concepts of right and wrong were twisted and intertwined until human morality became meaningless. And honestly, that's fucking horrifying.
Explorers in the further regions of experience. Demons to some, angels to others.
That's way scarier than Freywind's demons or Raphael's seductions, because there's something so uncanny and unnatural, and yet so uncomfortably logical about Cenobites. They're not here to hurt you, they're here to help you. But their idea of help is completely counter to our own.
You solved the box. We came. Now you must come with us. Taste our pleasure.
They could just obliterate all humanity in a matter of seconds if they chose to. But they don't. They wait for people to find them. They only engage targets who solve their puzzle box and are drawn to souls who seek their pleasure. And this box, it's hard to find. In the second film, Dr. Chenard spends a lifetime looking for it and can't find the real thing. It's a miracle how it keeps falling into our main protagonist Christie's lap, almost as if she's drawn to hell, like so many others. But Pinhead and his Cenobites seem less interested in people who don't seek them out. They have a code of order. They seem angry when they find that Frank has escaped them. The Frank is the main antagonist of the first film for those who haven't seen Hellraiser, but they're even more angry when they find he's murdered and skinned someone.
We want the man who did this.
When a young mute girl, Tiffany, is manipulated into solving their puzzle in the second film, the Cenobites leave her behind. She solves the puzzle and they don't take her, because, as Pinhead so eloquently puts it,
It is not hands that call us. It is desire.
even Kirsty, who solves the puzzle, is allowed to negotiate multiple times out of being sent to the Cenobites' labyrinth. The Cenobites might be horrific, but they have a code. They may break that code whenever they wish, but it's only their own self-restraint that keeps them adhering to that code. Except in the other Hellraiser films. I've only mentioned the first two here so far. In other Hellraiser films, Pinhead's goal is just to destroy humanity, and in turn the Cenobites become incredibly boring. Actually, the Pinhead and crew in the first two Hellraiser films, and some of the comics, versus the third and fourth film is a great dichotomy as to what I'm actually talking about here when I say that evil is boring in fantasy fiction. In the first two Hellraiser films, Pinhead and his crew are not the main villains. In fact, by comparison to the human villains in each, so that would be Frank, Julia, and Dr. Chenard, the Cenobites almost seem moral. They're a neutral presence that only arrive when they're summoned and perform a singular task. And all the people who summon Pinhead and the Cenobites are dissatisfied with their material existence and want something more. Yes, even Kirsty, our protagonist. But that something more is too much for most. Pinhead's chains being so iconic, it's strange to know that he only uses them on two people, and they're both the villains of those movies. Notably, they're even more morally ambiguous in the novella, The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. In the film, when Frank summons the Cenobites at the start, they take him away. The puzzle solving is consent enough. In the novella, however, they actually ask him multiple times for consent. Even more remarkable, at the end of the novella, they honor their deal with Kirsty. In some of the comics, they're even willing to protect young children from their abusers, given the situation aligns with their interests. Now, compare that to Hellraiser 3, where Pinhead just massacres an entire nightclub and turns random people into Cenobites. That's far more evil, and far less interesting. Come Hellraiser 4, the Cenobites are even more boring. They just want to take over the world, which is really dull. However, the conception from those who haven't seen a Hellraiser movie is that they're monstrous, evil, the main villains of the films, rape demons, oddly enough, despite never committing any sexual assault in the mainline films. This perception is wrong, because it's just not reflective of the reality of the core story that people fall in love with. Hellraiser 3 and 4 failed because the writers didn't understand what made the Cenobites interesting, and in turn made them generic, boring antagonists. They made the Cenobites a race of evil, when they're far more nuanced and far more morally ambiguous. That's not to say they are not dangerous. It's just simply that defining something so alien in terms as medieval as good and evil is reducing them in some ways, and reducing the levels of terror they invoke, which I think does them a great disservice.
I can feel myself rot.
But there's a different kind of evil as well. Diseases, curses, the Heartless, the Dark Eldar, zombies, vampires. All of these are characters who are afflicted by some ailment that drives them to do great evil. The Heartless are consumed by the darkness. The Dark Eldar feed on pain in order to keep their souls from dying. Vampires drink blood to remain alive. All of these figures are afflicted. It is in their nature to inflict harm. So naturally, they should be pure evil, right? Well, not really. As we've outlined before, evil needs to be a choice. If you're forced to do evil due to some greater affliction, that choice to commit evil is removed from you. It's taken from you. There's an external evil forcing you to do bad. Yes, many vampire societies and the Dark Elder Society are evil in structure, and we'll get to evil societies in a second, don't you worry. The forces driving them to commit violence kind of have them by the throat. If they don't feed, they'll die. Or worse. Again, this is a matter where they're dangerous and malignant, but not necessarily pure evil. Several stories that even feed into the idea that the afflicted can be horrified by their own actions. Louis from Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles, for example, is so mortified by his undeath that fellow vampire Lestat basically roasts him for the entire book, and several after. In some stories, like the original Dracula, the vampire is seen as supernaturally compulsed to do evil. See Lucy, one of Dracula's many victims in the book, who goes from a sweet, shy girl to a killer of children. But Lucy herself isn't evil. The affliction that Dracula spreads is. Everyone, including Lucy's fiancé and her numerous friends, end her life in order to save her soul from this curse. Destroying a vampire is seen as a good, because it saves the person compelled to do evil. When we get to zombies, it's even more simplistic. They're shambling corpses that bite people and eat them. Very few zombie films actually go into why zombies eat people, though the ones that do are existentially horrific. Return of the Living Dead is a great horror comedy, but there is one scene in this comedy that I find genuinely nightmare-inducing. Not because of what you see, but because of what you learn. The zombies in Return of the Living Dead are unkillable, and they can talk. Eventually, they strap down a zombie and ask why they do what they do. And the answer is horrifying.
Why?
The pain! The pain of being dead. It makes the pain go away.
Unlike some afflicted who feed for nourishment physically, they feed for nourishment existentially. And there are other examples of zombies too, like the Flood in Halo. They spread, consume, and spread. It's their mission. It's their only mission. But it's when the grave mind develops that we see the Flood are capable of great evil. The grave mind represents the entire argument in Micro. A small entity needs to feed, that's nature. But a sophisticated creature able to weigh the morality of its own actions and choosing to dominate everything on their own terms, that is evil. And the grave mind makes for a compelling, horrific villain. But those it afflicts, the individual members of the Flood, being part of its destructive hive mind, are extensions of its own will. Because the Flood is just an organism and just needs to survive.
Meaning schmeaning. The whole world's going bye-bye. You included.
So we've come to it by now, right? The evil race? Well, not so fast, because there's another caveat here. Are we talking about societies that are evil, or species that are evil on a genetic level? I know, caveats, but trust me, this distinction is very important. An evil society is one that promotes wickedness as a virtue. And often, they're based on real power structures, from cults to fascist authorities, but the fact remains, the problem is the social hierarchy. A great example of this? The Drow. In the Forgotten Realms, or Faerun, Menzoberranzan is home to the Drow, a race of dark elves who were cursed with dark skin by, you know what, I'm not going to unpack the racial implications of that. Menzoberranzan society is dominated by the Spider Queen Lolth, an evil entity who has crafted a society centered on upward mobility. Please the Spider Queen, and you will eventually rise up the ranks. Ways your house can rise up? Slaying your enemies in cold blood. The sneakier, the better. Also, eradicate the quote-unquote evil surface dwellers, especially the high-end wood elves. Being in the Spider Queen's favor grants incredible boons of power. Failing Lolth means a fate worse than death. Because of the actions of Menzoberranzan's many houses, surface dwellers in Faerun, from Baldur's Gate to Waterdeep, fear Drow. However, there are many Drow who have broken away from Menzoberranzan to either strike out or start their own lives somewhere else. If the source of evil is that they serve an evil emperor with selfish intent, that's far more nuanced. This is opposed to races that are on a genetic level evil, like say, the aliens from Independence Day. Independence Day is an incredibly fun movie with some of the most boring alien enemies ever. There's a reason we barely see these guys until the third act. The aliens are not interesting inherently. They just destroy and drive our protagonists, who are interesting, to act. And that's great for that last part. The movie never aspires to explore the alien mentality. They're just an abstract force the heroes need to rally up against. But as villains, they're just boring. They're sort of like locusts, though we never see them harvest our resources. They just travel from planet to planet, destroying everything before moving on to the next planet. And this is incredibly boring. They have incredible technology. They can't just use that. They're clearly not running out of resources when they come to Earth. Also, why not go to an unoccupied planet? Why have to eradicate a whole species of people? Because it's clear that it's fun for them. They're just choosing at a certain point to destroy life. A lot of 1950s alien invaders are like this. They show up, try to harvest the planet, kidnap our women, and then we have to blow them up. It's shocking when stuff like Plan 9 from outer space offered more nuance.
So what if we do develop this solanite bomb? We'd be even a stronger nation than now.
Stronger. You see? You see? Your stupid minds. Stupid. Stupid.
I mean, well, sort of. Other movies, like Humanoids of the Deep or other generic monster films, offer some creatures who are just hardwired to attack us and impregnate our women and then kill them for some reason. Sometimes in that order, sometimes not. Look, this isn't like with the xenomorphs, where it's part of their life cycle. The idea here, with Humanoids of the Deep specifically, is that they're just taking women away from the men, first by violating them, and then by destroying them. Maybe. Only one woman survives, and who has to suffer a horrific birth that's clearly inspired by Alien, but lacks that nuanced perspective of the life cycle of the xenomorphs. If the end goal were reproduction, why do they kill their victims? There's only one conclusion. They're evil. Or it's poorly written. One of the two. And then of course the video games. Tons of mooks just there for us to punch a lot. This is why the generic evil races are more welcomed in the gaming sphere than in books and literature and film. Because in a game, you need to punch a lot of people, at least in theory. Games like Final Fantasy might have super developed lore for each game, but their go-to monsters tend to be just pure evil that is no nuance, there's no perspective, just fight them. Now sometimes a story tries to justify the evil nature of a race by implying that they were all made by a villain, perhaps in a lab or by magic. While this ignores the Frankensteinian implications of conjuring life, it effectively turns evil armies into extensions of the big bad. In this case, if you strike down one of his mob, you're actually striking down an aspect of the greater evil you're already trying to stop. No more quandaries there. This is why games like Shadow of the Colossus, Undertale, and Spec Ops: The Line are so effective. They force you to confront the lives you're snuffing out. In most other games, the less you think about it, the better. That raises the question, are there any good all-evil races? Well, yes, the Skaveen. They're great. There's a bunch of chaotic ratkin. I love them. I was never like a big Warhammer fan myself, but just knowing these things exist now in literature, I'm now interested in doing more research into both Warhammer Classic and Warhammer 40k, just because of these guys. They're kind of wonderful. But let's analyze this from a storytelling perspective. There's only one story you can tell with an evil race. Stop them. There are many stories you can tell with an evil society, from intrigue to rebellion to deconstructing the hierarchy of power and, yes, stopping them, but it should be clear that an evil race narrative restricts a story rather than opens it up to different conflicts. You can tell fewer stories this way, not more. But I think I've very clearly omitted one particular evil race. What about orcs?
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
Orcs are the go-to evil race for many fantasy campaigns. They're big, powerful, and vile. Warcraft was one of the first pieces of media to popularize the idea of the friendly orc, or at least the noble orc. Before that, they were a race of evil, monsters, and all of it lifted from Tolkien. The orcs are elves that have been corrupted by Morgoth. Orcs, by the way, were just one of the many fell beings of shadow corrupted by Morgoth to enact his will. However, Morgoth's lieutenant, Sauron, went on to forcibly breed the orcs, employing eugenics to create a greater army. When Morgoth abandoned his orcs, they were left in disarray, having now been bred to only understand violence. They formed several factions that Sauron, upon his return, managed to unite under his banner. The orcs in many ways exist as a parallel to the influence the Ring of Power had on its victims, only unlike Gollum, who was overwhelmed by Sauron's will in a pitiful, tragic fashion, the orcs were bred to enact that will. However, they're no less afflicted than Gollum, despite their greater power. Orcs, in effect, exist as a corruption of nature. They're not naturally occurring, but rather a species forced into the likeness of a false god's image. In effect, they're an extension of Morgoth's and later Sauron's evil. Maybe. Even in Tolkien's Legendarium, the origins of orcs are complicated. What I just detailed to you is a general amalgamation of Tolkien's multiple orc origins. In the Silmarillion, we read, "By slow arts of cruelty were corrupted and enslaved, and thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of the orcs, in envy and mockery of the elves." In The Two Towers, Treebeard explains that all of Sauron's dark forces are parodies of naturally occurring creatures in Middle-earth, saying, "Trolls are only counterfeits made by the enemy in the great darkness, in mockery of Ents, as orcs were of elves." However, again in the Silmarillion, we hear another origin. "Whence the orcs came, or what they were, the elves knew not of them, thinking perhaps to be Avari, who had become evil and savage in the wild, in which they guessed all too near, it is said." The Avari, by the way, are essentially Tolkien's equivalent to the Dark Elves, elves to the east that had not traveled to Valinor. But this creates a few ethical problems that Tolkien in his works never explored, but Tolkien in his letters brooded over. If orcs were created to be evil, then they were denied the choice to do ill, and thus can't be compared to humanity's moral standards. But if orcs are fallen creatures, then they are capable of redemption and thus can be redeemed. In the article titled, "Let Us Now Praise Famous Orcs, Simple Humanity and Tolkien's Inhuman Creatures," published in Mythlore, Robert T. Talley Jr. writes, "This uneasiness is understandable when considering the origins of orcs, i.e. in Tolkien's world, not the philological or folkloric origins in ours. A subject of some disagreement, as even Tolkien changed his mind over time. Indeed, in unpublished manuscripts written in the 1950s and 60s, see Morgoth's Ring, Tolkien toyed with several different ideas to explain the orcs' essence, ranging from corrupted men, rather than corrupted elves, to low-level Maya, and hence fallen angels, like Sauron himself, and even to automata without reason, who were essentially puppets controlled by Morgoth or Sauron, an admittedly unlikely scenario. So why was Tolkien so torn up about orcs? Well, it comes to Tolkien's philosophies as a Catholic. In Middle-earth, only good can create, so why would a good god create an evil race? Evil in Tolkien's world exists to pervert and twist creation, but not make something new. And orcs were new. The other issue became moral. As we see in The Hobbit, orcs can raise families. Bolg blames Thorin Oakenshield for the death of his father, Azog, in the book. That implies that Bolg's attack is one motivated by a very sincere motivation, vengeance. Be it vengeance out of pride or genuine love for his father, Bolg is feeling a very real, very human emotion. So Tolkien struggled to reconcile these contradictory elements when constructing the orc. And yes, I know that The Hobbit uses goblin and orc interchangeably, but for the sake of argument, if the movies call them all orcs, they're orcs. So Tolkien had a problem. How do you justify an evil race the heroes would fight and kill without any ethical dilemma, while still maintaining the philosophical framework from which your work is built? The simple answer is, you don't. But that didn't stop other writers from using orcs, trolls, and goblins as generic bad guys, especially Gary Gygax in early Dungeons & Dragons. Though in fairness to early D&D, plot was secondary to gameplay. But nowadays, D&D is a role-playing haven. In those early days, it was a dungeon crawler, so you needed bad guys to fight. Ethics be damned. I'm not faulting early D&D adventures for failing to develop orcs. I am, however, critical of novels that relied on these evil races to fill their pages with fights, especially the Dark Elf trilogy written by R.A. Salvatore, because this series should have known better.
No day goes by where I am not tempted to return to my inborn nature.
One of the most powerful lines in Skyrim comes when you talk to the dragon Parthenax about the nature of good and evil. Dragons in Elder Scrolls are instinctually driven to dominate and subjugate those beneath them, but Paarthurnax has resisted his instincts in order to leave the world better off. He asks us one simple question.
What is better, to be born good or to overcome your evil nature through great effort?
Evil races are often used as external adversaries. You can mow them down without moral quandaries, but when you use them for internal examinations, then they become powerful. How can one be good if it's easy? The Forgotten Realms' Drizzt Do'Urden, by all accounts, is the antithesis to the evil race discussion in general. Born in Menzoberranzan, the place where the drow worship Lolth the Spider Queen, Drizzt is raised to be another tool for House Do'Urden. But thanks to the teachings of his father, learns to deprogram the lessons that drow society fought to instill in him. And so he goes out to experience the world, now with eyes uncontaminated by his former bigotries. I'm about to criticize the third book of the Dark Elf trilogy, but I want to emphasize that these first two books are incredibly powerful works that honestly do ring true to anyone who has ever had to unlearn toxic lessons instilled in them by society. Drizzt has plenty of empathy towards his fellow drow. He refuses to kill any, knowing that they're influenced by the evil cult of the Spider Queen. Later, we encounter Clacker, an innocent peck, transformed by a wizard into a hook horror. We watch in a manner that reminds me of Jeff Goldblum's transformation in The Fly, as Clacker's humanity is erased in favor of his monstrous instincts. Still, until the last, he fights against his evil nature. Indeed, the whole second book is filled with people resisting their evil natures, from Drizzt resisting his instincts as a hunter that he's been forced to develop to survive in the Underdark, to Drizzt's father, brainwashed and resurrected under House Do'Urden's command. But what makes everything frustrating is that while Drizzt has to overcome his evil nature, he doesn't seem to care when encountering gnolls, orcs, and goblins. He kills them without hesitation. Because despite all the effort the series goes into detailing how drow society grooms evil, Drizzt can't extend any sympathy to those orcs. Because they're evil, we see him refuse to kill Clacker or his sister because he can only see their potential for goodness, while at the same time, he mows down a dozen orcs in a few swings of his scimitars. Morality, it seems, is a proximate science. The closer you are to the protagonist, the less evil you are. And I feel this must have rubbed a lot of players the wrong way too, because over time, orcs and half-orcs, as well as drow, have become incredibly popular playable characters in Dungeons & Dragons. And this leads up to the release of Baldur's Gate 3.
Try again.
In many respects, Baldur's Gate 3 exists as a summation of what I'm discussing. Tieflings are a demonic race that are mistrusted by most of Faerun, with some being confused for devils. One such tiefling is Karlach, who even fought among Avernus, Hell's legions. But as anyone who's ever played Baldur's Gate 3 can tell you, Karlach is arguably the most ethical, moral member of your party. Just a ball of sunshine and incredibly strong muscles and just...
She looks like she could throw me over her shoulder and carry me to safety, should the need arise.
Anyway, where was I? Yes, Karlach! Karlach is great. But by this point, tieflings were already regarded as misunderstood in modern D&D culture. While tieflings were a playable monster race starting in 3rd edition, in 5th edition, they were elevated to one of the core races in the core rulebook. Tieflings are among the most popular playable races to play, so they've undergone a bit of a redemption among D&D players as of late. But you know what hasn't? Mind Flayers. Mind Flayers are the go-to evil race in D&D when you want something that's just evil. They eat brains to live, all exist as extensions of a singular elder brain who seeks only to enslave all for its personal benefit. If a Mind Flayer escapes, they just become a new elder brain with the same goal in mind. And they're essentially the big threat in Baldur's Gate 3. And Baldur's Gate seems intent on offering moral nuances to all its characters. So, does it redeem Mind Flayers? Now, unlike a true hive mind like the Flood, Illithids aren't under mind control necessarily. The Elder Brain simply affects the chemicals in their brain that influences their emotions and desires. It makes you want to serve the Elder Brain, rather than overtake your will entirely. So what happens when they break free? Now ordinarily a Mind Flayer would just become a new Elder Brain, but in Baldur's Gate 3 we see some different options. Baldur's Gate 3 has 2 good Mind Flayers, arguably more depending on what choices you make in the game, that have escaped an Elder Brain's control. They still deal with their incredible hunger, but pursue different goals. There's Omelum, a scholar who seems to genuinely want to help you along your journey. There's one point in the game where you have to break into an underwater prison, and he seems willing to let himself die in order to direct you towards multiple different people who he thinks you need to rescue more. Now granted, you can rescue him and he's very grateful, but he doesn't seem concerned with his own well-being in the face of others being hurt, either out of a sense of moral obligation or simple logic. Then there's the Emperor, a Mind Flayer responsible for the creation of Baldur's Gate itself, who may also be manipulating you for a partially selfish reason, but still works hard to support the party in the face of great evil. Sure, you may have to destroy all of the Githyanki's hopes and dreams in the process, but that's just a coincidence. The Emperor's morality is actually really interesting, because he resorts to some extremely shady choices, but it's for the greater good. I mean, you understand his greater good by the end of it, if you're willing to work with him. But he's also willing to lie, enslave, and murder to get there. But the question is he morally dubious because he's a Mind Flayer, or was he always like that? And I cannot emphasize this enough. This is a huge spoiler for Baldur's Gate 3. If you choose to let Karlach become a Mind Flayer in the game's climax, you learn in this newly instilled epilogue that she has tried to use her powers for good. When she needs to eat brains, she seeks out those who are terminally ill, asks them for permission, and then chooses to devour their brains, seeing it as a means to preserve their memory within herself. Karlach, you were just too good for this world, even with tentacles. So, guess who I romanced in the game first? Seriously.
Throw me over her shoulder and carry me to safety.
Now, none of this makes the Mind Flayers good, but it does show that goodness can maybe exist in a race that's otherwise seen as pure evil.
Get on with it.
Yes, get on with it!
The idea of a pure evil race to fight is boring, unless that fight is internal. When a character is able to overcome the societal or instinctual programming instilled to them to do bad, that's interesting. In this sense, the evil race is less the focus, and more an emotional struggle against internalized evil. And this opens the door up to so many more stories, rather than limits the viewpoint when it's just fight the bad guy, beat the bad guy, save the world. So going back to that thread I mentioned at the start of this video, I read through a bunch of the old posts while scripting to see if there were any particular counter-arguments to consider before drafting this article that I would consider, What I found, however, was a lot of people arguing one simple thing. Sometimes simple is better. They would often say, assigning human morals to scary monsters makes them just misunderstood, or stop turning devils into sad men with scary suits, and you know what? I didn't have a counter-argument for that because I don't really disagree with it. We shouldn't turn devils all into sad men. They should be scary demons. We shouldn't assign human morals to scary monsters. They should be monsters. But we can make them understandable. The xenomorph is a monster, but it's an animal too. It is trying to follow its life cycle. But let me ask you this, why do you want something simple? At the end of the day, an evil race is boring only because it limits the types of stories you can tell, or at least the ways through which external conflict can manifest. It's not inherently bad. You can tell a good story with boring antagonists, but it is so disappointing when a story fails to engage with the potential of its world. It becomes a sentence half written.